French art history. Introduction. French art has a long and rich history, dating back to the primitive but exquisite prehistoric cave paintings of the Dordogne, Auvergne and Ardèche, but it took centuries before the first signs of true maturity and style emerged in medieval times. In one way or another, most movements and pieces of art created on European soil in the last 3 centuries can be associated with some form of French artistic expression. One cannot truly understand the phenomenon of modern art without investigating this country's past, as France has been on the forefront of intellectual and artistic life for hundreds of years. Since the foundations of modern-day Europe were laid down in the times of Charlemagne, France played a pivotal role in all aspects of the old continent stage, eventually bestowing upon itself a stunning cultural heritage. Starting with the courts and monasteries of the Middle Ages, the French have left their stamp on art, architecture, music and literature. However, as did the rest of their neighboring countries back then, they stayed within the conventional borders of what was acceptable on a global level without venturing too far into experimenting. It was the Renaissance period that allowed the French to emancipate their artistic vocabulary and start defining what we nowadays call Western culture. This period helped France to blossom into a cultural powerhouse. Artists started channeling specifically French traditions into their works, while schools and universities began dedicating much of their efforts to exploring art, especially architecture. This set in motion the process of self-defining French identity in a cultural sense, and the rest of Europe started to take notice. New churches, palaces, châteaux, fortresses, museums and galleries were popping up on a regular basis, and painters around Europe started to perceive France as a unique safe haven and a central stage of the civilized society. Since then, in theater and literature, poetry and philosophy, painting and sculpture, architecture and music, some of the greatest names in art have been French, and their heritage remains an integral part of European culture to this day. Why art history is important. Art from the past holds clues to life in the past. By looking at a work of art's symbolism, colors, and materials, we can learn about the culture that produced it. We also can compare artwork, which provides different perspectives and gives us a well-rounded way of looking at events, situations, and people. By analyzing artworks from the past and looking at their details, we can rewind time and experience what a time period different from our own was like. Looking at art from the past contributes to who we are as people. By looking at what has been done before, we gather knowledge and inspiration that contribute to how we speak, feel, and view the world around us. Art history provides a means by which we can understand our human past and its relationship to our present, because the act of making art is one of humanity's most ubiquitous activities. Prehistoric art. People have been painting in France since prehistory. The magnificent cave paintings at Le Chauvet in the Ardèche, dating from around 30,000 BC, are among the world's oldest, far older than other fine examples of Paleolithic art in caves at Pechmerle, near Cahors, or Lascaux. These are all art produced in what is now France, but to call them French art would be quite inappropriate. French art did not begin to exist before France came into existence, and even in the time of Charlemagne, in the 9th century, art was not national. Where it existed, it was either part of a European culture, spread through the networks of pre-medieval monasteries, or else it was local, largely out of touch with even what was going on even in the next town. Medieval art. Merovingian art. Merovingian art is the art of the Merovingian dynasty of the Franks, which lasted from the 5th century to the 8th century in present-day France, Benelux and a part of Germany. The advent of the Merovingian dynasty in Gaul in the 5th century led to important changes in the field of arts. Sculpture regressed to be little more than a simple technique for the ornamentation of sarcophagi, altars and ecclesiastical furniture. On the other hand, gold work and the new medium of manuscript illumination integrated barbarian animal-style decoration, with late antique motifs, and other contributions from as far as Syria or Ireland to constitute Merovingian art. Carolingian art. Carolingian art comes from the Frankish Empire in the period of roughly 120 years from about 780 to 900, during the reign of Charlemagne and his immediate heirs, popularly known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The art was produced by and for the court circle and a group of important monasteries under imperial patronage. Survivals from outside this charmed circle show a considerable drop in quality of workmanship and sophistication of design. The art was produced in several centers in what are now France, Germany, Austria, northern Italy and the Low Countries. The Carolingian era is part of the period in medieval art sometimes called the pre-Romanesque. Romanesque art. Romanesque architecture appeared in France at the end of the 10th century, with the development of feudal society and the rise and spread of monastic orders, which built many important abbeys and monasteries in the style. It continued to dominate religious architecture until the appearance of French Gothic architecture in the Isle de France between about 140,000–115,000. Distinctive features include thick walls with small windows, rounded arches, use of the groin vault at the intersection of two barrel vaults, all supported by massive columns, a level of tribunes above the galleries on the ground floor, and rows of exterior buttresses supporting the walls. Decoration usually included very ornate sculpted capitals on columns and an elaborate semicircular sculpted tympanum over the main portal. Interior decoration often included murals covering the walls, colored tiles, and early stained glass windows. Gothic art. French Gothic architecture is an architectural style which emerged in France in 1140 and was dominant until the mid-16th century. The most notable examples are the great Gothic cathedrals of France, including Notre Dame Cathedral, Reims Cathedral, Chartres Cathedral. Its main characteristics were the search for verticality, or height, and the innovative use of the rib vault and flying buttresses and other architectural innovations to distribute the weight of the stone structures to supports on the outside, allowing unprecedented height and volume. There was addition of larger windows, including enormous stained glass windows, which filled the cathedrals with light. The French style was widely copied in other parts of Northern Europe, particularly Germany and England. It was gradually supplanted as the dominant French style in the mid-16th century by French Renaissance architecture. Early modern art. Baroque art. French Baroque architecture, sometimes called French Classicism, was a style of architecture during the reigns of Louis XIII, Louis XIV and Louis XV. The style was originally inspired by the Italian Baroque architecture style, but, particularly under Louis XIV, it gave greater emphasis to regularity, the colossal order of facades, and the use of colonnades and cupolas to symbolize the power and grandeur of the king. Notable examples include the Grand Trianon of the Palace of Versailles and the Dome of Les Invalides in Paris. Later, the colossal orders gradually disappeared. The style became lighter and saw the introduction of wrought iron decoration in rocaille designs. The period also saw the introduction of monumental urban squares in Paris and other cities. Rococo. Rococo, also known as late Baroque, is an exceptionally ornamental and theatrical style of architecture, art and decoration which combines asymmetry, scrolling curves, gilding, white and pastel colors, sculpted molding, and trompe-l'oeil frescoes to create surprise and the illusion of motion and drama. It is often described as the final expression of the Baroque movement. The Rococo style began in France in the 1730s as a reaction against the more formal and geometric Louis XIV style. It was known as the style rocaille or rocaille style. It soon spread to other parts of Europe. It also came to influence the other arts, particularly sculpture, furniture, silverware, glassware, painting, music, and theater. Although originally a secular style primarily used for interiors of private residences, the Rococo had a spiritual aspect to it which led to its widespread use in church interiors. Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is a movement in architecture, design and the arts which was dominant in France between about 1760 to 1830. It emerged as a reaction to the frivolity and excessive ornament of the Baroque and Rococo styles. In architecture it featured sobriety, straight lines, and forms such as the pediment and colonnade. In painting it featured heroism and sacrifice in the time of the ancient Romans and Greeks. It began late in the reign of Louis XV, became dominant under Louis XVI, and continued through the French Revolution to the Bourbon Restoration until 1830, when it was gradually replaced as the dominant style by Romanticism and Eclecticism. Prominent architects of the style included Anne-Jacques Gabriel, Jacques-Germain Soufflot, Claude-Nicolas Ledoux and Jean-François Chalgrin. Painters included Jacques-Louis David and his pupil, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Romanticism. Romanticism was a literary and artistic movement that appeared in France in the late 18th century, largely in reaction against the formality and strict rules of the official style of Neoclassicism. It reached its peak in the first part of the 19th century, in the writing of François-René de Chateaubriand and Victor Hugo, the poetry of Alfred de Vigny, the painting of Eugène Delacroix, the music of Hector Berlioz, and later in the architecture of Charles Garnier. It was gradually replaced beginning in the late 19th century by the movements of Art Nouveau, Realism and Modernism. French Romantic painting was sometimes called theatrical Romanticism. It was based less on expressing philosophical ideas than upon achieving extravagant effects, with the dramatic use of color and movement. Figures were twisted or stretched out, canvases were crowded with figures, and lines were sometimes imprecise. Realism. Realism was an artistic movement that emerged in France around the 1848 Revolution. Realists rejected Romanticism, which had dominated French literature and art since the early 19th century. Realism revolted against the exotic subject matter and the exaggerated emotionalism and drama of the Romantic movement. Instead, it sought to portray real and typical contemporary people and situations with truth and accuracy, and not avoiding unpleasant or sordid aspects of life. The movement aimed to focus on unidealized subjects and events that were previously rejected in artwork. Realist works depicted people of all classes in situations that arise in ordinary life, and often reflected the changes brought by the industrial and commercial revolutions. Realism was primarily concerned with how things appeared to the eye, rather than containing ideal representations of the world. Impressionism. Impressionism was a 19th-century art movement characterized by relatively small, thin, yet visible brushstrokes, open composition, emphasis on accurate depiction of light in its changing qualities, ordinary subject matter, unusual visual angles, and inclusion of movement as a crucial element of human perception and experience. Impressionism originated with a group of Paris-based artists, whose independent exhibitions brought them to prominence during the 1870s and 1880s. The Impressionists faced harsh opposition from the conventional art community. In France, the name of the style derives from the title of a Claude Monet work, Impression, Solo Levant, which provoked the critic Louis Leroy to coin the term in a satirical review published in the Parisian newspaper Le Charivari. Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism was a predominantly French art movement that developed roughly between 1886 and 1905. From the last Impressionist exhibition to the birth of Fauvism, Post-Impressionism emerged as a reaction against Impressionists' concern for the naturalistic depiction of light and color. Its broad emphasis on abstract qualities or symbolic content means Post-Impressionism encompasses Les Nabis, Neo-Impressionism, Symbolism, Cloisonnism, the Pont-Aven School, and Synthetism, along with some later Impressionists' work. The movement's principal artists were Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh and Georges Seurat. Post-Impressionists extended Impressionism while rejecting its limitations. They continued using vivid colors, sometimes using impasto and painting from life, but were more inclined to emphasize geometric forms, distort form for expressive effect, and use unnatural or modified color. Thank you.